Every time I think I'm sort of over that hill, there seems to be another hill that's bigger. There's never a moment you've made it. It's a challenge that doesn't stop. It's relentless, but I enjoy that. I think that's something I've enjoyed with cooking and restaurants in general.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Regional dining has become one of the most influential ingredients shaping our culinary voice. But what's it like to not only run one of the most important restaurants in the country, but representing one of the world's greatest wines too? Scott Huggins is the director of Magill Estate Restaurant and Kitchen at Penfolds in South Australia. Scott, how are you?
Very well, Anthony. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to get you on the show. You've got a hell of a gig there. How are things at the moment?
Things are good. Things are really good. We're ticking along.
Tell us a little bit about Magill Estate Restaurant and Kitchen and sort of what it encompasses for those that haven't been there.
So Magill Estate is the spiritual home for Penfolds. It's quite unique in the sense it's a vineyard in a suburb, 20 minutes from Adelaide City. We sit on 10 acres here. Some of the wine that gets picked here does go into grains. So, we still have open ferment tanks here that we still make wine here. There's two restaurants, a more, fine dining restaurant as such that seats 35 covers, and then a bistro that we do, 75 covers in one sitting. More of the food that we, enjoy eating, and then more food we like to create.
I know you've been there a decade now and you're well and truly comfortable in that role, but what's it like sort of being associated with Penfolds? Is there an obligation and a nervousness in regards to what you do with one of the world's greatest wines?
Maybe at the start, the shoes were quite big to fill, but I think Penfolds and I have a great relationship moving forward, and we enjoy working with each other, I think, in a great deal.
Does that sort of have an interplay with your food and the dish creation? Are you mindful of the wines that are produced as well?
Yes, always. I think that the advantage we've got is we've got such a great back vintage cellar here at Magill. So, the dishes will always come first, and we've always created the dishes, but then we've always had the opportunity then to go through a lot of back vintage and choose wines that suit the dishes that we've created. And the same sort of ethos where, we're choosing the best ingredients we can as they choose the best grapes they can, but it doesn't have to be from a certain vineyard. It could be multi-vineyards, and the same as us getting product. We go across to different suppliers to choose what we want.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about sort of your connection with suppliers. South Australia is renowned for extraordinary produce on land and sea. What's some of the connections that you've made with producers that appear on the menu?
So probably the main one would be Scott de Bruin. Him and I have built a great relationship over the last 10 years. I actually used his product over in Singapore, and it was, such an amazing product. But now, being here in South Australia and building a connection with him from day one, we wanted to align, the likes of grains with, what I think is the best Wagyu in the world, which was Scott's product. But, the opportunity to be in a restaurant and take your staff down there and enjoy the farm, for them to see where it comes from, them to talk to the farmer is an unreal experience. And something that, we treasure.
I want to explore sort of your cookery and what you're doing there at Magill Estate shortly, but take us back to when you were young. Whereabouts did you grow up and what sort of role did food play?
So I grew up in the Dandenong Ranges, so a little place called The Patch, in between Monbulk and Belgrave. My property was sort of 10 acres and it overlooked the jam factory. So I don't know if anyone that's my age remembers Monbulk Jam. That factory was the paddock across from my house. So as a child, you'd smell the jam getting cooked. It didn't last that long. It ended up getting turned into a plastic factory for pots, but it was the beginning. We had, as young kids, Mum had Anglo-Nubian goats, so she'd milk the goats and obviously give us the milk as kids. It wasn't sold; it was just for the family. And Mother was brought up on a dairy farm, and Dad was brought up on a pig farm. So we weren't brought up on a farm, myself and my brother. But I think them being on farms, sort of played a big part of work ethic and so on. Mum was the oldest daughter out of 8 kids. So she had 5 brothers that worked on the dairy farm and 2 sisters. But as the oldest daughter, I think, from the age of probably 12, her responsibility was to help her mum cooking and cleaning and doing all the rest of it. So she was a pretty unbelievable cook. It was a great upbringing.
Is there any sort of family dishes or feasts that you recall your mum making from when you were young?
No, we never she'd do a lot of roasts, and I end up complaining about it. Like, bloody hell, there's we'd have a roast lamb and a roast chook and roast vegetables, and I'd whinge about it as a kid. And now we're looking back, going, oh, but we're pretty lucky in that sense. And her pav, she used to make a bloody good pav, and grandma's sponge cake was pretty legendary.
When did you first sort of start thinking about a career as a chef, and what sort of triggered that?
I've always loved cooking, or not. Sorry, I've always loved food, not so much the cooking. In a great manner. I was obsessed about food to the point, Mum tells the stories now that I'd, at the age of sort of 5 or 6, at school, I'd ask Mum what was for dinner before school had even started. And she's like, I don't know. Why would you be asking me now? I said, because I'd like to think about it all day. So she still gives me shit about that. But I've always loved food. But I think, it was my 21st birthday. They had some cards read out during the night, and there was a card when I was about 7 years old that I wrote to my babysitter that I was in love with at the time, and I wrote this card saying, Gig, when I get old enough, I'll be a chef and I'll cook for you every night. And they read this card out, and it was quite funny because I ended up being a chef.
What were the sort of first steps into commercial cookery for you? Where did you cut your teeth?
So I got to year 9, struggled with school in a great deal. I'm not very good at reading and writing. And my attention span for that stuff was really bad. So got to year 9. They suggested I spend some time looking at different trades. So we did a course at a TAFE and did a few different things like cabinet making and electronics and everything else. That nothing really tickled my fancy. I always loved food. So I got the opportunity to do a day in the kitchen a week, so which sort of was a Wednesday. And it was a place called Locke, which is up in the Dandenongs. It was sort of a quite an iconic restaurant back in the day. So I used to spend a day up there on a Wednesday helping the kitchen, and I think I fell in love with it straight away. So I worked on Wednesdays, and I think we got to the end of year 9, and I worked on Christmas Day, and he asked me if I'd like to work on New Year's, and I said, no problem at all. And then on New Year's night, after we finished at sort of midnight, he asked me if I'd like to do an apprenticeship. And I still remember, getting home that night and calling Mum because they were at some party and letting her know that I'd been offered an apprenticeship, and they were, so supportive and over the moon because they knew that I hated school, and that was probably the best thing for me to sort of keep moving forward.
Do you have any stories from those first couple of years of what it was like for you and sort of when you felt sort of comfortable in your career?
I still don't feel comfortable. I'm not sure. It was hard. Like it was really hard in the early days. It's a hard job, I guess. So I've always tried to push myself out of my comfort zone, and when it sort of became a little bit comfortable, I'd moved on to another establishment, and just doing stupid shit when you're young and you've got no common sense in the kitchen. I still remember this time when I was an apprentice, and everyone had gone home. It would have been 1 o'clock in the morning, and the floor was filthy, and there was this hose near the plunge. I thought I'll just hose the floor down. So I was sitting hosing this floor for probably 20 minutes, and I realised there was no drainage holes. So the only come down about 2 o'clock in the morning, and this kitchen's flooded with water, and I'm trying to mop it up by myself at the age of 16.
Amazing. As you started to build your career, who were the really influential people and venues that you worked at?
The first sort of serious restaurant I think I got back from overseas was working with Teague. I sort of was his sous chef at 21, and that was sort of it was a really cool time for me to work. It had a really good kitchen culture. Oh, I thought like a rock star sort of culture. We worked hard and played hard, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the team mentality of that place, and Teague was a really good mentor, at that time. And then moving on from there, I worked with a restaurateur named Ignatius Chan, so Iggy's in Singapore. That was number 26 in the world when we went over there. And he was probably the first person, and still is actually the first person I've worked for who's the restaurant owner, who wasn't the actual chef. He was a sommelier by trade. So a very different view on the customer. And, he sort of enlightened me that chefs spend too much time cooking for chefs and not for customers, and sort of taught me to stop thinking about cooking for chefs. It's an ego thing, which was, it was really enlightening. And then met Dan Hunter there. Dan came over and did a dinner at Iggy's, and then fell in love with what Dan was doing and how good he was as a cook. So I finished up there. I was in Europe for a little bit, and then came and worked with Dan at the Royal Mail, and he sort of taught me a different level of cooking that I'd never seen before. A clinical way of running a kitchen that I still implement in some way today.
Take us back to that period of time at the Royal Mail. It was such an important and influential time, and Dan Hunter sort of really brought that venue to life. Do you have any stories of what he's like to work with?
Dan's just so precise. If you could look at a surgeon in a chef, it would be Dan. And for me, I was just, admired the way he cooked. He wasn't rough around the edges. He was precise. The way he seasoned was just educational. The garden, it was just another level I'd never seen before. But yeah, difficult kitchen to work in. We would run the bistro from the same kitchen as the restaurant. So you're you're getting orders in for the bistro, and then you're also trying to run the restaurant at the same time. And that was one of the hardest, kitchens to work in for me at the time. But yeah, it was an amazing place. He taught me a lot.
You spent a fair bit of time abroad, and particularly in Japan as well. Tell us about your time there.
Yeah, so Japan, I finished up with Dan. The idea was to go across and work with Narisawa and Yamamoto, both their restaurants, and I ended up starting at Yamamoto's restaurant Ryogan as a stage, and I think within the first 3 to 4 weeks, he'd offered me a paid job, which wasn't much. We're talking $500 a month pay. About $500 a month plus accommodation. But that was a big eye opener for myself. Ingredient wise and precision on food and respect for technique and seasons that you've never seen before. Australia talks about 4 seasons, but Japan have seasons that run like micro seasons. It could be a product that's there for 3 weeks, or a fish that swims up the river and they can catch it for 2 weeks. It's these little tiny seasons that, an eye opener. Yeah.
Was there any sort of particular ingredient or dish that really sort of stands out in your memory from that time?
Probably fugu shirako, so the sperm gland from the pufferfish. That was pretty special. It sort of come in at a real short season, but yeah, something that's pretty mind-blowing.
What did you take from your time from Japan, and what was it like coming back to Australia after that?
With Japan, just the respect for ingredient was probably what I took from there. To outsource, or not outsource, the wrong word to use, to source ingredients that are so special, and then apply a technique just to bring out the best of that ingredient was just something that you don't see in Australia. And I think the best way that Japanese would describe them versus how we cook, or how the Japanese cook compared to us, is we look at an ingredient and we say, how are we going to cook this ingredient? And they look at an ingredient and say, how are we going to cut it? And that's the best way of looking at it, So they have a different theory about what they're looking at with the texture or the way that it's been handled. but it's also very hard because you work with all these amazing ingredients, and we have all these different fish coming in bags that are alive, in so much live seafood coming in and whatnot. But then you come back to Australia and you don't have access to those ingredients. You don't have access to a lot of that stuff. So it's sort of trying to research out some special little bits here and there, but it's difficult you could never cut and paste what you do there and here.
How did you end up in South Australia?
Yeah, so I finished in Japan, and we thought I'd come back to South Australia to sort of get my feet back on the ground. It sort of seemed like a cheaper option than moving back to Melbourne at the time. So to come back here and save a little bit of money and get my sort of head above water. And then obviously I didn't know too much about Penfolds, but Penfolds was advertising for a role, and I didn't really know too much about the role and probably was a bit ignorant coming into it. Applied for it and got it pretty quickly, but it was a pretty crazy story of me working for small restaurant owners and chef owned restaurants to a corporate business. Someone that can't even read and write, and I get this job and I was sitting in front of a computer getting an email and typing with one finger going, what have I got myself into? But a pretty big learning curve, and I still remember the job interview. They said that they'd fly me down to Melbourne to continue the interview process, which they booked me a flight and gave me a cab charge. And I remember ringing Dad and saying, Dad, they've actually booked me a flight to Melbourne for this interview and given me a cab charge to get to the interview. He's like, oh, you've made it, son. This is like this is like an unheard of thing in the last sort of 10 years of my career, where we just worked so hard, did everything for free and just expected to be on the door and so on. So it was a bit of a wow, what have I got myself into moment. But yeah, it was pretty amazing.
You were following in the footsteps of the late Jock Zonfrillo. What was it like for you having to create your own food in that environment, following in his footsteps? Was it challenging?
Same thing. I came into it very ignorant. I came back from Japan. I didn't know too much about what Jock had done or Penfolds itself. So I sort of had my head up my bum in some sense with that. And it was my first sort of head chef role to run the kitchen. I'd been the head chef for Ryan Cliff over at Tipping Club and so on, but obviously it was his creations and his running of the kitchen. It was my first opportunity to do what I was going to do. So I was probably so caught up in me trying to create what I'd learnt in the last 10 years. And there was difficulty. I think at the time the journalists in South Australia were sort of putting each other against each other, which wasn't cool. Trying to see who was the top dog and us versus him, which is the wrong way. I don't really agree with. They could have celebrated two great restaurants in South Australia, but they sort of put two restaurants against each other. But that was that. So at the start, there's a little bit of competition as such, but that didn't last long. We ended up getting on.
Tell us a little bit about your food and your approach. Is there a dish or two that sort of exemplifies your cooking?
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to the Japanese, me being in Japan, with trying to find an amazing ingredient and doing a minimal amount just to bring out what speaks that dish. Sort of a dish that we did was just a piece of Wagyu with a technique that I've learnt in Japan to cook it, which was sort of seared in a really hot pan and then iced in ice water to stop the cooking process. And then poached, not in a bag, but just poached in an oil bath, sort of at that low temperature. Then taken out and dried, and then cooked over charcoal with garlic soy, sort of sprayed on the outside of it, on and off, on and off, on and off, and then we'd do that, and then we'd just serve it as is on a plate with a little bit of mustard on the side. I think, we did that a couple of years into when I'd opened the restaurant, but it was a bit of it's just a piece of beef on a plate moment. And, but yeah, I think the feedback was good and it was sort of something that sort of stayed on the menu.
In more recently, you moved from being chef to director of the whole venue. What's that transition been like for you?
Huge, huge. Yeah, so the one thing is, that first moment of being a head chef and running a kitchen and working with a corporate company for 10 years and learning a lot of the corporate ways of doing things and trying to embrace a lot of it and the challenges of it, but learning a lot of it and thinking I knew most of it, and then taking over the lease of the business and being the sole director. So I haven't got any partners in it. It's just myself in that sense. And the learning curve has just been the same the last 12 months, 18 months. The amount that I've learned, the amount that I thought I knew that I didn't know, is huge.
Penfolds is a producer of Grange, one of the world's great wines, and it's launched all over the world. Do you have any stories of the adventures you've been on cooking for sort of the launches of Grange?
Yeah, so that was some of the great part of working with Penfolds. We've done some amazing things around the world, and we've launched it. I think you and I were in Shanghai at one stage. We did a launch over there. That was one of the times that I sort of had went down in the kitchen in Shanghai. There's 450 guests. I actually took a chef from Magill that was Chinese to help me sort of translate in the kitchen with these guys, and we got there and he didn't speak the same dialect, so it wasn't as helpful as I thought. And then we got to where we were meant to do this dinner, sort of about 6 hours before kickoff, and I got told there was no flames allowed inside the venue, and we could only use these warming boxes. So 450 people with no flames and a warming box. It was sort of one of those times where I fucking went down pretty hard.
A lot has changed in the world of hospitality in the last couple of years. What's sort of your approach, and what are you doing over the next sort of year or two with your role?
Well, I've got 10 acres up in Piccadilly, so 20 minutes from the restaurant here. We're investing a lot into sort of trying to produce some vegetables and fruit and nuts and so on for the restaurant. So we're putting a lot of stuff into that. And then obviously trying to compost a lot of the wastage from the restaurant. We're looking at implementing some composting things into the restaurant to help with that, that side of things. But yeah, it's probably for me at the moment, trying to produce and grow things that we can control. That's probably the next step for us. Yeah.
Well, you've been doing amazing things there for over a decade now. What do you love about what you do?
I love it because there's never a dull moment. It's always a challenge. I think, every time I think I'm sort of over that hill, there seems to be another hill that's bigger. So I think that's the drive. Well, that's the inspiration for me. Is it's always there's never a moment you've made it. There's always a challenge, and to keep the restaurant relevant, to keep the staff motivated, and keep sort of being in front of people, is a challenge. It's a challenge that doesn't stop. It's relentless. But I enjoy that. I think that's something I've enjoyed with cooking and restaurants in general. There's never a moment that it just slows down. It just fucking keeps going. It's relentless, which is my pull to it, I guess.
A couple of times during this chat, you mentioned that you weren't very good at school and you found it challenging, and that was not your forte, and yet you've become one of the best chefs in Australia. What sort of advice would you give to a young professional looking to carve out a career in hospitality?
It's relentless, and if that's your work ethic and you like to be pushed, it would work for you. It's hard because even for me going through my apprenticeship, my brother's a maxillofacial surgeon, so he's a double doctorate, and I left school when I was 15 and can't read and write. So same parents, same school, same everything, but obviously totally different kids. But even for that, my parents would question, my pay, or why was I getting, working so many hours, and why would I go to Japan and work for next to nothing, and why would I go to Singapore and work for next to nothing? And my argument was always, but Richard's got a HECS bill. He's learning to be a doctor, and he actually has to pay for that to become his, to get his end goal in his career. What's the difference between me trying to carve out my career and doing it in the best possible way to get to where I need to get to. So yeah, that's sort of, I think if you choose to be a good cook or you choose to cook, you can learn a lot, but sometimes it comes at the cost of working hard for it. It doesn't get handed to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, it's an absolute honour to catch up with you, and can't wait to see where you take Magill Estate from here on. Please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.